World War I is remembered for its trenches, its soldiers, and its staggering human cost. But behind every shell fired and every soldier fed, another war was raging. An invisible war, fought not with rifles, but with balance sheets, banknotes, and credit. This was the first truly financial war of the modern age, the war that transformed gold into paper, debt into power, and citizens into lenders of last resort. To understand how this happened, we have to step back to the early 20th century, to a world that still believed in gold. Before 1914, money meant something tangible. Every major power was on the gold standard, meaning each unit of currency was directly backed by a fixed amount of gold. It was a system built on trust and discipline. Governments couldn't print what they didn't have. Gold acted as a brake on power. It limited how much nations could borrow, how much they could spend, and how far they could go into war. And then in the summer of 1914, that limit was shattered. When the first shots of World War I were fired, something else quietly died. The world's faith in gold as the foundation of money. Governments across Europe realized something brutal. They couldn't finance a modern industrial war with gold alone. The cost was too vast. The trenches devoured money faster than bullets. And so, they turned to credit. Within weeks of the war's beginning, countries suspended the convertibility of their currencies into gold. Citizens could no longer exchange paper for metal. The printing presses began to roar as governments issued war bonds and flooded economies with paper promises. The invisible war had begun, a battle for control of the world's money supply. The home front became a financial battlefield. Governments couldn't simply print everything they needed citizens to buy in, literally. And so, propaganda became economics. Posters urged people to lend to defend the nation. In Britain, the US, Germany, and France, patriotic duty was redefined as financial participation. Ordinary citizens were told, buy war bonds, support your soldiers, earn interest while saving your country. It sounded noble, but it was also the greatest transfer of savings in modern history, from citizens to states, from savers to debtors. In Britain, the Treasury launched massive war loan campaigns. In the United States, the government introduced Liberty bonds, turning millions of ordinary Americans into creditors of the state. But behind the patriotic slogans was a darker truth. War bonds weren't backed by real assets, they were backed by promises. Governments pledged future taxes, future growth, and future generations to repay the costs of the present war. It was, in essence, borrowing the future to destroy the present. The bond campaigns worked. They funded armies, navies, and industrial giants. But they also unleashed something governments couldn't easily control: inflation. By 1916, prices across Europe had doubled or tripled. Gold had vanished from circulation. Money once scarce and real became abundant and abstract. For the first time in modern history, debt replaced gold as the foundation of the financial system. And the bankers understood what this meant. During the war, central banks evolved from guardians of gold to engines of credit. The Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and later the Federal Reserve became the silent partners in wartime spending, expanding money supply, purchasing bonds, and coordinating with treasuries to keep the illusion alive. The old monetary world was gone, and no one noticed until it was too late. When the war finally ended in 1918, millions were dead. But the debt lived on. The world's economies were shattered, and yet their governments owed more than ever before. Britain's national debt had increased tenfold. France's finances were in ruins. Germany, facing reparations and internal collapse, became the epicenter of financial chaos. To pay their debts, nations did what they had learned during the war. They printed more money, and the result was catastrophic. In Germany, the Weimar Republic faced impossible reparation demands from the Treaty of Versailles. To pay, they printed marks until the paper was worth less than the ink it was printed with. By 1923, Hyperinflation consumed the German economy. Workers were paid twice a day. Children made kites from banknotes. Savings lifetimes of hard work were obliterated overnight. Across Europe, the middle class discovered that money was not wealth. The war had destroyed more than nations. It had destroyed trust in the very meaning of value. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States emerged as the new financial superpower. It had entered the war late, lent vast sums to the Allies, and now held most of the world's gold. The center of global finance shifted from London to New York, and with it, a new era of monetary dominance began. But even in victory, the seeds of the next crisis were already planted. The 1920s were built on easy credit. Stock markets soared on borrowed money. Governments, believing they had mastered debt, continued to manipulate currencies and expand balance sheets. But just like the trenches of Europe, the foundations were unstable. When the crash came in 1929, it was the logical consequence of everything the war had created. A world addicted to credit, unmoored from gold, and blind to the limits of illusion. Where of war, I didn't just change borders, it changed money forever. Before the war, debt was a tool. After the war, it became the system itself. Central banks became permanent fixtures of national life. Governments learned that deficits could be managed, inflated away, or simply rolled forward. And ordinary citizens learned something even more devastating, that their savings could vanish overnight. Not through war, but through policy. The 20th century became an empire of debt, a financial world built on the same mechanism that had once funded the trenches. Every major crisis since, from the Great Depression to the 2008 collapse, traces its roots back to the same lesson. When nations abandon real value for political convenience, collapse always follows. The war had shown governments they could suspend gold, print paper, and survive at least temporarily. And once that precedent was set, there was no going back. The gold standard was officially buried in 1971 when the United States ended dollar convertibility, but in truth, it had died in 1914 when the world first chose credit over constraint. From that point on, every financial system has been built on trust in governance, in banks, and in the illusion that debts can always be repaid. But history whispers a warning. Trust is the first casualty of financial war. World War I was not only a geopolitical conflict, it was the financial turning point of the modern world. It transformed the way money was created, the way governments financed themselves, and the way power flowed through society. The soldiers who fought on the front lines paid with their lives. The citizens at home paid with their savings, and the bankers, who fought their war behind closed doors, emerged with more influence than ever before. What began as a war for territory ended as a war for control of the future. The mechanisms born in 1914 still shape your life today. The bonds, the debt, the inflation, the constant expansion of credit that defines our global economy. And yet, the story is not hopeless. Because once you understand how the system was built, you can start to see through it. You can recognize that wealth, ISNT, the digits in a bank account, or the interest on a bond, ITS, what can T be printed or inflated away, skills, assets, production, independence. Every crisis, every collapse, and every new solution offered by governments traces its roots back to that invisible war of 1914. History's greatest financial lesson is not just about numbers, it's about power. And those who understand the history of money understand the true nature of freedom, because the war for your wealth never ended. It just moved from the trenches to the balance sheets